second last row from the bottom here, is a 500 kilo cow on maintenance. Now, if we have a look, the megajoule requirement for that 500 kilo cow to do maintenance is 60 megs. So it's actually the same level of intake as what a weaner is. Their protein is much lower, so it's 7 to 9% crude protein, and their potential intake is out to 15 kilos. Now, obviously, depending on the nutrient density of the feed, they're going to derive 60 megajoules of energy from far less than 15 kilos of intake. And one of the points I'll make before I throw it over to question time is that as we get more rainfall, if we do actually generate dry matter, and certainly those producers that have taken the option to contain livestock and rest some of the paddocks and have left some residual dry matter there, those paddocks are going to respond a lot better. They're going to be able to get some solar panels up and create some growth. We can obviously use some additional nitrogen and gibberellic acid to try and boost that dry matter production. But in those scenarios, if we let the cows out of containment first, and keep in mind that if we've got them contained, their requirement's actually the same. We're getting a 600 gram weight gain out of the weaner. The cow's doing maintenance, but on total, they're eating the same amount of feed. Now, if we let those two animals out, that calf, that 200 kilo weaner, is still going to go out there and eat at 6 kilos because that was its total intake. Let's assume we've got them on a 10 megajoule high protein hay or a TMR ration or hay and pellets, whatever it is. If we had 10 megajoule of energy per kilo, 6 kilos is our 60 megs. The problem is if we let this cow out, so the weaner's going to go out, it's going to eat at 6 kilos. It's probably going to actually get a higher weight gain because there's going to be more than 10 megs per kilo in pasture if it's fresh. But if we let the cow out, although we only wanted to eat a 60 megajoule, she'll now go out and eat 15, could be up to 18 kilos of pasture. So she'll eat 3 times what the weaner eats, put on quite a high weight gain and consume a lot of that green feed. So I think we often have the approach where we want to feed the weaners because we want to get a weight gain out of them. Cows, we only want maintenance. We're prepared to have them pinned down on pasture. But when we get to the point that we have a growth event and we let them out, I think it should actually be considered that we should let the weaners out first and keep the cows behind. Even if that's as simple as hot wiring them to an end of a paddock and feeding them in that paddock so that the bulk of the property is capturing some growth potential. So that was one comment I wanted to.
Sorry, Shane, you're on mute.
Enter, hit mute instead of next slide. Sorry, team. Yeah. While we're on that, is there any questions on that before I roll on to the next thing? I think it's an important point at the turn of the season.
So, Shane, that same principle applies for sheep systems, doesn't it?
100%. Your maintenance energy requirement is identical whether you're a mouse or an elephant. It's a linear relationship. So yeah, I do apologise. My knowledge in the sheep space is not as strong as the cattle, but from an energy point of view, it's identical. So what we're saying is these animals, like those weaners, they're eating the maximum they can to get that 600 weight gain. And so when we let them out, they'll get a little bit of an uplift in performance because the energy density goes up, but their intake will be the same. But if we let those cows out, they could eat 3 times as much. And that's damaging because we don't need them to do a heavy weight gain, and we do need that pasture to accumulate. So pinning them down with low quality fodder is an approach that will help build a little bit of a feed wedge with what growing opportunity we've got.
So, Shane, you just might want to unshare and reshare your screen because at the moment you're showing ourselves back to us rather than your slides.
No worries. I was trying to get you to talk, but that sounds good. Yeah, you've just got me now. Is that true?
Yep, that's better. That's better. Yes.
Any comments on that from the floor?
Sandy, practically, have you got you containing stock, or are you managing your weaners preferentially at the moment? I'm just picking on you because I can.
Yeah, so we've got about a bit under 500 cows locked up on barley straw and some liquid supplement, and about maybe 600 weaners, maybe 700 weaners getting fed just some hay, and one of those mobs is on hay and some liquid supplement as well. Just they're on a different farm, so we're just trying to contain as much as we can to get country away, and then ideally with probably eyeing off 4 to 5 weeks time that we'll start letting stuff out based on growth rates. It's what the plan is. We'll see if we can stick to it.
Yeah. What do you expect growth rate's going to be, Sando, given temperature where it's at, and dry matter?
Yeah. So dry matter's, we're starting from a pretty low base, mate. I don't know. It's hard to say. Prior to that, or even just after that rain, based on some modelling, we were still at 0 growth rate. And it probably took a week for that, post that first rain, to, I guess, start.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To start it or not?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I don't know, mate. It's hard to say growth rate wise.
It's not 500 to 600.
Ballparking it, probably.
Feeding them.
Good day, we might have 20 kilos.
Prices come like cows in.
Growth. But yeah, we've had noticeable good growth since the rain because the frost has stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can see some of those paddocks that have been locked up with residual, their ability to respond's a lot better. But there is a cost in leaving that fodder there. If you've replaced that fodder in the paddock with fodder that you've had to bring in as supplementary feed, there's a cost there. But it'd be pretty interesting to model the benefit of the increased growth rate versus the cost of feeding. And it's the same on the way out, I would have thought, if you contain them for longer to get a feed wedge to hopefully create a higher growth potential, then that's there as well. Like the growth rate's not linear, is it? Like as those plants have got more dry matter and capturing more sunlight, the growth potential is increasing. So I'll share my screen again, and I'll just go to some other material. Here we go. Is that everyone happy with that? Yeah. This was just the idea, effectively what I was talking about before, where if we have a look at the growth potential of animals increases as their body weight increases. So on the right, we've got the rumen, just for stylised imaging, of a 200 kilo weaner. The maintenance energy requirement for that animal is 34 megs. If we want it doing 600 grams a day, that's 58 megs, which is their numbers before. But the maintenance, if we look at maintenance, that's actually 60% of their potential intake, right? So only 40% can be allocated to production. If we look at the cow on the left, we've got a 580 kilo cow. Maintenance is 67 megs, but this is 40% of her intake. So if we let her out onto pasture, she'll in fact do 2.5 kilos a day, which we know happens when we buy light, dry cows and put them onto feed. So that's a really pointless weight gain, and I'm just trying to support the fact that it's two principles here. One is the heavier an animal is, the lower the maintenance becomes as a percentage of what they can eat on a daily basis. And secondly, if we have both of these animals out on pasture, we're going to get an excessive weight gain out of high consumption rates or high intake rates out of the cow. So just need to be aware of that. Some feeding rules of thumb, just so that everybody's got them. So confinement of cattle does save about 8 megs of energy per day, which is 10% on a typical intake of a cow. So it is important to consider confinement. If you were to save 10% of your sup feeding bill, that's gonna be significant. When we look at the utilisation of body reserves, 1 kilo of weight gain onto the animal is 40 megajoules. or 4 kilos of feed. 1 kilo off is 32 megajoules. So this is an 80% conversion efficiency, which is much better than what we can do with any of our conserved feeds. So utilising body reserves, very efficient at 80%, and we don't have any labour input to utilise to feed that out. So we need to make use of these body reserves. It's important to know that a spring calving cow can do everything she needs to do in the production cycle, starting at a 2.5 body score base. So any weight in excess of that is, again, fodder that we've had to bring in to have that excess, which comes at a cost. So just be aware of that. But a lot of cattle have used a fair bit of their body reserves at the moment. I think that you've got to have feed values to do feed budgets. I think that's fair. Too often we're using standardised figures on hays and silages, and in support of what Sandy was saying before, you've got to keep an eye on the paddock. So we can model out what we expect animals to do on a ration or what we expect pasture growth rates to be, but we really have an obligation to continue monitoring the animals, looking at body condition score on the cows, looking at weights on the growing stock, looking at kilos of dry matter available in the paddock, and correcting our plan accordingly. So to set and forget can become very, very expensive, but also very frustrating. If people think they're going to feed, I mean, the worst thing, there's only one thing worse than feeding, and that is feeding and not achieving the outcome. So if we're going to feed, we need to be using feedstuffs we have a good idea of and know how they're going to work. Some other quick rules. So when we're talking about intake, there's a very simple rule, which is the 1-2-3 rule. This is a percentage of their body weight in dry matter intake. So 1% for survival, 2% for maintenance, 3% for production. So very basic rule, but for a lot of people, they'll actually find this quite useful. So if we're going to walk into a mob of dry cows that we've got locked up, if they're 600 kilos, we want to feed their maintenance. 2% of 600 kilos is obviously 12 kilos. They're going to need roughly 12 kilos to maintain. To be more accurate, if we have a feed test, the equation is pretty simple here. It's 120 as a fixed number divided by the NDF of the feed gives an intake potential. So if we're dealing with a cereal straw at an NDF of 60, which is very common, 120 on 60 is 2%. That's our maintenance type ration. There's no way that weaners are going to do a weight gain on a 60 NDF cereal hay. If we're looking at a bale of vetch hay that might have a 40 NDF, which is very common, 120 divided by 40 equals 3%. 200 kilo weaner can eat at 6 kilos, and they'll be doing in excess of half a kilo. So hopefully you'll find that as useful as I do, but it's a good rule of thumb. I'll just flick through. I didn't really want to give a talk on the feeding, but I did put together some information on supplementing, and I was going to make it briefer than this, and then I sort of got a bit hooked as I pulled it together. But if we look at what the macro minerals are, we've got calcium, good content in legume and most grasses, grains low in calcium. So whenever we're feeding grain to sheep or high grain TMR rations, we should consider supplementing with calcium. Phosphorus, Southern Australia, not much of an issue due to phosphorus fertilisers. A lot of information in the north about supplementing phosphorus. Sodium, commonly deficient in diets and really important for the absorption of other minerals. So there's a bit of a recommendation there on intake. But salt, best thing about it's self-limiting, and the opportunity to make up loose licks with based on salt are really valuable. Chlorine's not normally an issue. Normally is potassium or sulfur generally for livestock performance. Magnesium, I should have had it up the top under calcium really, but magnesium, calcium and sodium are the three big ones. Everyone will have heard of grass tetany. This is due to consumption of grass dominant pastures in lactating cows. Now we can increase the risk of grass tetany through applications of nitrogen and phosphorus. Cattle on grazing crop, good support to provide calcium, magnesium and sodium. When we're containment feeding, generally conserved fodders are going to be quite adequate for those, so they're not going to be an issue. If we go to the micro minerals, we've got cobalt, converts to B12 in the rumen. Most forages are adequate. It can be added to grain-based diets, but not normally going to be necessary. Copper, again, we don't see much copper deficiency in the area that's represented by everyone here tonight. A common deficiency in coastal soils can be supplemented if required. Selenium is probably the big one. Plays a role in reproduction, certainly in calf viability and immune competence. The original or the historical soil profiling shows lower levels southeast of the freeway, and certainly wouldn't be worried about the others for containment feeding. What's probably more interesting, a lot of people talk about ADE injections. Vitamin A is provided by grazing green pasture, and it deteriorates through the conservation process of fodder. So it's important for skin and mucous membrane health. Skin we're obviously not too worried about, but mucous membranes can be important with a lot of the functions through the animals. So we need to be adequate for vitamin A. The suggestion here, they can store this for 60 to 90 days. So the suggestion for cattle that are contained off green feed would be that if they're going to be fed for greater than 3 months, to step in and give a vitamin ADE injection. Now, at this point, that's not going to be an issue. A lot of us are hoping that, we're out of confinement feeding at least in 4 to 5 weeks, certainly by the end of July or August, start of August. But yes, I think that's a reasonable recommendation. If they're going to be in containment off green feed for 90 days, they'll need an ADE injection. That'll cover vitamin E. It falls much under the same principle. They get it from grazing green pasture, is important in immunocompetence. Vitamin D helps the absorption of calcium and phosphorus from the intestine, but they synthesise from the exposure to sunlight. So the only time we're ever going to need to supplement that in Australia is cattle fed under shelter. Any questions on supplements?
I have a couple, but I want to give everyone else a go first. So jump in, guys, if you want to ask a question.
Shane, I just had a question on, is any of those nutrients or micronutrients more important when we're placing animals under stress in confinement? Like, is selenium become a bit more important then?
Most conserved fodders, particularly if there's grain in the ration, are very adequate in those, Sandy. So it wouldn't really worry me. I think I find it funny, like a lot of the time, like if we think about a more average year, we'd have these cattle out on pasture, we'd be short enough, we'd be utilising body reserve, their intakes would probably be less than what you're giving those cows in straw, I suspect. But the energy density of it's a little bit higher, but the micro and macro mineral profile would probably be lower. So, we confine cattle and then get this urge to, confine stock, sorry, I keep referring to cattle, but we confine stock and then get this urge to make sure that we're not missing anything else, which is valid. But my point is, on a relatively balanced diet, in the short term, all we need to be worried about is energy and protein, in my opinion. I think that conserved fodders are going to be pretty good. Are they under stress? Nutritionally, I think that we can have them fed very well. So I don't actually think they're under that stress. They're under a little bit of stress as far as some societal sort of reshuffling and living in confinement. That is a factor. Certainly, we've got dust exposure, water quality issues we need to maintain. But no, I wouldn't be changing approaches to that in the short term.
Questions? Right, I'm going to chuck one in while people are thinking, Shane. Loose licks for things. So where I'm feeding out at home, a calcium, salt, magnesium mix. Magnesium's obviously the expensive part of that mix. Sorry, a lime, salt, magnesium mix. how important is the magnesium at this point in time? Is it something that we can reduce the proportion of within that mix? Because at the moment I'm doing a 2 to 1 to 1, but I've also been told by the various agents that we can actually reduce the magnesium down quite a bit.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that the magnesium requirement, like if we're talking lactating animals, whole different equation. So part of the issue. I mean, animals can't store magnesium, so they need to eat what they are going to utilize in a 24-hour period. They have to eat it on a daily basis. So that's important to understand. They cannot store it. They can store calcium. They can store a lot of the other macro minerals. I would be comfortable to back the magnesium off. I think that its biggest role is when we've got animals on grazing crops or we've got lactating breeding animals with that high level of output. I mean, I'd be tempted to leave it in the mix so that they're supplemented, but I think you could wind it back. One thing to be careful is the magnesium's often the deterrent in the mix. So just be careful if you don't wind the magnesium back that their intake doesn't significantly increase of the supplement without it in there. Not that that's a negative. As long as they've got access to water, they can handle quite a high salt intake. They'll equilibrate themselves. But no, I mean, what are we feeding is probably the primary question. If we're feeding growing stock and dry cows, which is what most of us are feeding, then it wouldn't worry me.
Okay. More questions? The only other one I was going to ask, Shane, selenium, it's a bit of a man-made little barrier we've got of the Hume Highway. There's been reports that there's been some, a little bit west of that. What do we do if we suspect that there might be something at play there? What are the things that we need to look for?
Super simple. Some on-farm research and decide if you can justify it and move forward on that basis. I think it's important to understand that these levels are lower after these wetter years and higher production years. It does deplete the level of selenium that's available. I think got to be really careful. Blood testing will often find low selenium levels. In a perfect world, we'd be taking liver biopsies. The reason to take a liver biopsy is it gives us a greater cross-section of the animal's mineral status rather than just a snapshot at that point in time. But obviously there's some simplicity around using blood samples, so that's what we tend to use. My preferred approach is to simply go in and do some on-farm trial work, which is as easy as just treating odd number ear tags and not the even number ear tags and monitor the outcome and then basically replicate that year on year. It's pretty easy to calculate the marginal cost and therefore we can have a look at what the weight gain is. The point I was trying to make in the beginning is these things look pretty cheap compared to most of the supplement feeding we're doing. And so in these years where animals are really up against it and we're wanting them to perform as well as we can, I'm not saying throw the book at it, but selenium's one thing that probably could be justified at the moment to try and optimise performance of at least the growing stock. Wouldn't be as worried about breeders. Depends how well reproductive rates have been. So I don't know if that answers it, but yes, I wouldn't treat the freeway as a rigid border between areas that are deficient and areas that are not. I would suggest either do some monitoring testing or even better, just do some on-farm trial work. But that trial work's not going to help you in the short term, obviously. Yep. It'll help you for next year.
Excellent. Good advice, Shane. Good one. We have got a question. At what stage of pregnancy do you stop calling it a dry cow? So that's obviously going back to the magnesium calcium question. Is that right, David? I'm assuming that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, obviously at the point of calving, we call her a wet cow, but her requirement increases typically at month 7. So for the last 2 months, certainly the last 6 weeks, we see an increase in their requirement for energy and protein and some of the macro minerals like magnesium. Again, I'm not too worried about magnesium until they turn on that lactation tap, but it's the fetus that's pulling a higher requirement of energy and protein. Keeping in mind that we grow about 85% of that fetus in the last 100 days, but we're potentially growing up to, almost 60% in the last 6 weeks. There's a lot of fetal growth at the back end of pregnancy. And so we see probably a 15% uplift in energy requirement as we go towards the point of calving. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
We might have a chat. I wanted to have a chat about urea as a protein source. I think that there's a lot. I think the Northerners are much better at using urea as a protein source than what we are, and that's based around the fact that they've got a lot of access of high roughage fibre source, and which is often protein deficient. So urea is a really cheap form of protein for the animal. They can use it, but it's important to understand that it can't represent all of their protein requirements. So it's what we call a non-protein nitrogen, which is degraded in the rumen. So I might share my screen again. I've got a very basic little flow chart here. Can everyone see that? So what we can see, so within the diet, we have what we call crude protein. The reason it's called crude protein is it's a crude assessment of what it is. So based on the nitrogen level, we can estimate what the protein supply is from that. Now, within crude protein, we have two types. We've got the true protein, which is utilised by the animal, and then we've got the non-protein nitrogen. If we look at the true protein, we've got the undegradable protein or bypass protein. This protein is not broken down or degraded in the rumen, and in fact bypasses straight through to the small intestine where the animal can absorb it directly. So that's really good protein. On the other side of the equation, we've got protein that enters the rumen and is utilised by the microbes to enhance fermentation, and that allows the production of microbial protein in the rumen that is then absorbed in the small intestine. Now, the way to think of that is that basically what we're doing is we're feeding nitrogen to the microbes, which increases the population of microbes and the level of activity. And as a byproduct, it's actually microbes that are falling out of the rumen into the small intestine that make up microbial protein and some of the energy sources. So it's a good source of protein, but obviously if we have too high a levels, we can lead to high levels of ammonia. So we've got a cycle going on there between ammonia and urea. The animal is able to utilise a portion of that. Then it's able to excrete a portion, and if we're in excess of that, then we get toxicity. So recommendations, I'll just go to this next slide. That's kind of the same image, really. The recommendations are that it can be at an inclusion rate of 0.5 to 1% of their diet. Now, this equates to about 15 to 30% of the total crude protein in the diet, but there is a limit to how much they can use. Now, one thing that's different between what's happening in the north and what's happening down here is that in the north, they're supplying these urea supplements in loose licks or roller drums or any number of formats. But the animals have got ad lib access to a high roughage diet. So those microbes are able to use that carbohydrate in the feed with the nitrogen to produce protein. One thing it does is improves the digestibility, which increases their intake. So you've actually got the benefit on an ad lib type ration that the supplementation of urea improves their intake, which means they can eat more, which means they can derive more energy and protein from what they're eating, as well as the fact that increasing that nitrogen level leads to a higher microbe population and more microbial protein. So don't know if that makes sense, but it is a complex cycle. But what's happening down here, which is very different, is that we are restriction feeding these cattle. So it's a different equation when you're not actually allowing the animals to go and increase their intake as a result of that improved digestion or digestibility. It's not to say it's not important, and it does still create that uplift in microbial protein. Sorry, I might have a question there.
That's all right. Finish the topic and we'll come
Yeah.
back to it because it's just coming back to the loose lick. I'll answer it in just a minute, Alison.
Yep. So look, that's about it. We'll talk about the loose lick, but I think that just understanding that it can be a portion of their protein intake, but not their whole protein intake. It's different when we're restriction feeding. And importantly, really importantly, understand that calves are not actually ruminants. So calves need 100% true protein in their diet. They cannot use urea to promote microbial protein absorption through the small intestine. They are not yet ruminants. They're designed to drink milk, and they're starting to develop their rumen, but we can't use urea as a protein source in growing animals. Sorry, we'll open up to the questions.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So Alison has asked about, is it best to put out a mineral block or loose minerals as in salt, lime, dolomite, sulfur, or loose lick? So that's kind of along the same lines as what we were asking before, Shane.
Yeah, I think what's important here is the cost point of providing that. So we know we need an amount of roughage. We know we need an amount of energy. So our whole diet is based around achieving that energy. We then hope that we're giving them enough protein in that equation. If we're not, we then go to supplementing others. I probably missed the point there a little bit, but I would put out a mineral block or loose minerals. I mean, I'm a huge fan of loose lick mineral supplements. The animals, if they're made well, the supplements are self-limiting, and they're going to be a lot cheaper than the commercialised products you can get a hold of.
And that probably goes for urea blocks as well, does it, Shane?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I've got we might have a bit of a chat about the urea blocks. Now I've stolen some figures here. I'll just share my screen again. I've punched. How do I get out of that? Yeah, everyone's still with me. So I've just gone onto the DPI feed cost calculator just as a really quick way of calculating the cost per protein. And what I did here, just for a bit of context, we've got to be careful on the liquid supplement. So I'll put in here an example of a liquid supplement. Now I might have the pricing wrong, so anyone hit me up, but I've got this in at $1,300 a tonne, which is for a 1,000 litre shuttle, so $1.30 a litre. Those supplements are typically 60% dry matter. Depending on what's in the mix, the molasses is normally giving a little bit of a hit of energy, but the primary reason we're using those dry feed supplements is the high protein. Now, they've got urea included in there, and that urea actually tests out at 281% crude protein. Now, that might sound really funny, but it's a relativity measure. We've got to remember that urea is 46% nitrogen, and that to calculate crude protein from nitrogen, we times it by 6.25. So that's how they work it. But if we look at the cost per kilo of protein with those liquid supplements, we're ending up at about $8 a kilo of protein. For context, if we were to compare that to even just a lucerne or vetch hay at $400 a tonne, which is pretty expensive coming in, we've got 90% dry matter, we've got our 10 mgs of energy, 22% protein, a lot of that being true protein. We're back at $2 per kilo of protein. So I think, just trying to use this as an example, that I'm a big fan. I think urea's got a real role if we're feeding high roughage, low protein diets. But bringing it in the supplement is expensive. And if we're prepared to put the effort into making up a loose lick, we can do so at a lower cost. So that would be my key point there. The other thing is that dry cows pre 7 months pregnant really only require 7% dry matter. lot of those straws or header tailings won't be far off that. And so that's something to keep in mind.
Very good.
So I suppose to give a bit more context, with regards to the liquid supplement, you obviously, I'm not suggesting you're replacing it with the hay, but there's actually the potential just to shandy a bale of high protein hay in with straw on a once a week basis to deliver protein to the ration. And if we can land that protein cheaper, it's the same. I suppose I'm assuming everybody's comfortable with calculating a cost per megajoule on feed that comes in, but that's where that DPI feed cost calculator can really help. But the same is for protein. So if we're worried about protein, it's about how can we introduce it at the lowest cost possible.
So this is probably just a good time, Shane, to remind people that if they want to do feed tests to find out what they've got, we've got all the gear in the office there to be able to do those feed test sampling for the silage and for the we've got the kits there, so come grab one from us, and you know it doesn't take long to take it up to DPI and send it off to DPI and get it tested. It's pretty cheap, really.
Yeah, absolutely. The other point I might make, and I'm sorry to keep flicking everyone around, but I'll share my screen again. The other point to make is that protein is actually a total requirement. We talk about a percentage a lot of the time, but it is actually a total gram requirement. And so if we're feeding a restricted ration, like it's all the percentages are based, I don't know if that opened, here we go. All the percentages are actually based on an average type intake, but this is the actual protein requirement of animals. So if we look at this column down here, you know, a 635 kilo cow on maintenance requires 730 grams. And that's a pretty low requirement. Now, if that animal's eating 10 or 12 kilos, that's down to 6 or 7% of her diet. And that's what that number's based on. But if we've got that cow restricted and she's only eating 7 kilos of dry matter because it's 10 megajoule hay, well, then it really needs to be a 10% crude protein ration to meet that 700 grams of requirement. Does that make sense? So we've got to be careful talking about it as a percentage. The animal doesn't use percentages of protein. The animal uses grams of protein. And so percentages are based on an average intake, but understanding what they're doing is a bit more important. And we can see, again, here's a good example. If we want a 270 kilo weaner to do 900 grams, they're going to need 800 grams of protein in their diet. And if they're only eating 6 kilos, then it's obviously well in excess of 12% protein and be 14 or 15% protein. So that one possibly confuses the point, but I'm just trying to make the point that they use a total requirement. Percentage is the way we look at rations, but if we're going to heavily restrict their intake, we've got to be a little bit aware of that.
You could be feeding more than you need.
Yeah, absolutely. You could be feeding more than you need, or you could be not feeding enough because you've actually got a straw hay that's only 7% and you're only feeding them half their requirement and getting them to utilise some body weight. And in that scenario, they'd be quite protein deficient, which will be fine for a short period, but at some point that pregnancy is going to suffer some degree of consequence of being protein deficient when the calf's trying to grow.
All right, so Shane, it is now 8:22. We promised to finish this off by 8:30. Jess has got a couple of questions he wants to ask at the end. Do we want to open it up to just random questions now? What's on people's mind? What's the thing that's anything that you want to ask Shane at all? You don't want to ask in person put something in the chat.
Yeah, throw it at us. It'd be
Yep.
much more interesting. That's why we're here.
Shane, I've got a question. Recently changed to moving or shifted to corn for basically our grain ration for sheep at the moment. But I've noticed probably in the last, maybe they've been on a mix of barley corn for probably 10 days, and then once they went straight corn, quite a quick milk let down, and they're probably still 7 to 10 days from lambing. Didn't know whether that was normal for that type of ration, or is it just something in corn that makes them let down milk a bit quicker? Haven't lost, well, we've probably lost a couple, but like no more than normal.